The courtroom fell silent as Teresa Howard, wearing a faded courthouse janitor's uniform, stepped toward the defendant's table, with her wrists trembling, but her head held high. Across the room, Assistant District Attorney Ethan Mitchell opened his case file, convinced he was about to prosecute another employee who had betrayed the public's trust. Neither of them knew that 20 years earlier, on a freezing night inside Chicago's Union Station, Teresa had wrapped her last blue blanket around a shivering baby in a stranger's arms and nearly frozen to death herself. Before this trial ended, the truth would change far more than a verdict. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Tell us your country and your local time in the comments. And if stories about kindness, courage, and second chances speak to your heart, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next journey. 20 years earlier, before anyone in Cook County Courthouse knew her name, Teresa Howard was simply another face people hurried past without seeing. At 6:10 every morning, the back door of Miller's Corner Diner on West Madison Street would swing open, releasing the comforting smell of bacon, fresh biscuits, and hot coffee into the icy Chicago air. Teresa always arrived 15 minutes early. She believed showing up before everyone else was a way of thanking life for every chance it still offered. She never complained about the long hours. She never argued over extra shifts. While the cooks joked loudly and the waitresses traded stories about difficult customers, Teresa quietly chopped onions, washed vegetables, and prepared soup stock with the same careful hands her grandmother had taught her to use years before. "Food remembers how it's treated," her grandmother Eleanor Howard used to tell her. "If you prepare it with anger, people can taste it." Teresa smiled whenever she remembered those words. She smiled often back then, though fewer people noticed each month. The bruises became easier to hide beneath long sleeves. The excuses became easier to repeat. "I slipped. I bumped into the cabinet. I wasn't paying attention." Her husband, Calvin Howard, had once been charming enough to make strangers believe he was the kindest man in the neighborhood. At home, he became someone entirely different after losing his construction job. Anger replaced conversation. Alcohol replaced responsibility. At first, he only shouted. Later, he broke plates. Eventually, he broke promises. And then he began breaking Teresa. She stayed longer than she should have, believing every apology would be the last. She kept hoping the man she married would return if she loved him enough. Instead, every month became worse than the one before. On a bitter December evening in 2006, Teresa finished a 12-hour shift and walked home carrying a small paper bag that held leftover dinner rolls the diner manager allowed employees to take home. She had barely unlocked the apartment door when Calvin demanded money. "There isn't any," she answered softly. "There has to be. I paid the electric bill." His face hardened. The paper bag fell onto the floor. Dinner rolls scattered across the tiny kitchen. Calvin shoved her hard enough that she struck the refrigerator. "You think you're smarter than me?" he yelled. Teresa tasted blood inside her mouth but said nothing. Silence, she had learned, sometimes ended the storm sooner. Not always. That night the storm lasted nearly an hour. When Calvin finally stumbled into the bedroom and fell asleep, Teresa remained sitting on the cold kitchen floor. The apartment had never felt smaller. Her eyes drifted toward an old canvas backpack resting beneath the table. Inside were only a few belongings she truly considered hers. 3 changes of clothes, a worn family photograph, an old wallet containing exactly $18.43, and folded with extraordinary care, a thick navy blue wool blanket. Its edges were frayed from decades of use. Near one corner, golden thread formed a tiny, hand-stitched star where Eleanor Howard had repaired a tear many years earlier. Teresa reached out and gently touched the stitching. She could almost hear her grandmother's voice. "When you're cold, this blanket will keep you warm." Then, after a thoughtful pause, Eleanor had added something Teresa never forgot. But warmth isn't meant to stay with one person. Young Teresa had frowned. What does that mean? Her grandmother smiled while wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. Warmth is something you pass on. Back then, Teresa thought they were only talking about winter. Years later, she finally understood they had been talking about people. She quietly stood up. Without making another sound, she packed the backpack. She looked around the apartment one final time. The tiny kitchen, the chipped coffee mug she had bought at a thrift store, the curtain she had sewn herself, the cracked clock that always ran 5 minutes slow. None of those things were worth staying for. She wrote only one sentence on a torn grocery receipt. I choose to live. She left the note beside Calvin's wallet. Then she walked out into the freezing Chicago night. No dramatic farewell. No shouting. No revenge. Just footsteps disappearing beneath fresh snow. Outside, icy wind swept through the nearly empty streets. Every breath hurt. The city seemed enormous when someone no longer had a home waiting for them. Teresa spent the next several hours walking because walking kept her warm. She avoided dark alleys. She avoided bars. She avoided anywhere Calvin might think to look. Just before midnight, she arrived at Union Station. The Great Hall was quieter than usual. Travelers rested across wooden benches while security officers wandered between waiting passengers. The station wasn't home, but it was dry. It was warmer than the sidewalks. And for people who had nowhere else to go, that sometimes meant everything. She found an empty bench near one of the tall stone columns. Removing the navy blanket from her backpack, she folded it carefully before wrapping it around herself. Its familiar weight settled over her shoulders like an old friend's embrace. For the first time that entire day, she allowed herself to cry. Not loudly, just enough for the tears to disappear before anyone noticed. Nearby commuters rushed toward departing trains without looking in her direction. Businessmen rolled expensive suitcases across polished marble floors. College students laughed while sharing headphones. Families gathered around paper cups filled with hot chocolate. Life moved around Teresa as though she were invisible. No one asked whether she had eaten. No one wondered why a young woman sat alone with all her belongings inside one faded backpack. No one noticed the exhaustion behind her eyes. She understood something painful in that moment. Loneliness wasn't simply being by yourself. Loneliness was realizing people could look directly at you and still never truly see you. Teresa pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and leaned against the cold stone column. Tomorrow she would begin searching for another job. Tomorrow she would visit churches and shelters. Tomorrow she would figure something out. She had survived worse than uncertainty. Closing her eyes, she whispered the words her grandmother had planted in her heart years ago. Warmth is something you pass on. She had no idea that before the next sunrise, those simple words and the blanket wrapped around her trembling shoulders would change 2 lives forever. Union Station settled into a different rhythm after midnight. The loudspeaker announcements became less frequent. The steady flow of travelers thinned until only scattered footsteps echoed across the marble floor. Custodians pushed squeaking cleaning carts beneath the high arched ceiling, while security guards made slow rounds through the waiting area, their radios crackling softly in the silence. Outside, snow continued to fall. Not in thick, dramatic sheets, but in tiny, relentless flakes that coated every parked car, every iron railing, every rooftop. The digital thermometer above the entrance flashed 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Teresa tucked her hands beneath the navy blanket and tried to sleep. She counted her breaths. She listened to the distant rumble of departing trains. Every few minutes, the automatic doors slid open, letting another wave of bitter wind sweep across the station before closing again. Sleep never truly came. Around 2:15 a.m., she heard something that didn't belong. A baby's cry, weak, hoarse, interrupted by tiny gasps. Teresa opened her eyes. At first, she couldn't see where the sound was coming from. Then she noticed a young woman sitting on the floor near the far wall, beside a broken vending machine. She looked no older than 24. Her thin denim jacket offered almost no protection against the cold that seeped through the station each time the doors opened. In her arms was a baby wrapped in what looked like 2 thin towels. The child was crying less now. That frightened Teresa more than the crying itself. Babies stopped crying when they became too cold. She watched quietly for nearly a minute. The young mother kissed the baby's forehead over and over, rubbing his tiny hands with desperate urgency. "Please, stay warm," she whispered. Teresa looked away. She knew she shouldn't get involved. She had $18. No home, no job, no family she could call. If she gave away the blanket, she might not make it through the night herself. She tightened it around her shoulders. The baby whimpered again. A station employee walked past, carrying a cup of coffee. He glanced toward the young mother, hesitated for half a second, then kept walking. A businessman rolled his suitcase by without slowing down. 2 teenagers looked over, whispered something to each other, and disappeared toward another platform. The young woman lowered her head. Embarrassment seemed to weigh more heavily than exhaustion. Teresa stood. She took one slow step, then stopped. Her grandmother's voice echoed through her memory. "Warmth is something you pass on." She looked at the blanket. It still smelled faintly of cedar from the old wooden chest where Eleanor had kept it every summer. This wasn't just wool. It was the last physical piece of the only person who had ever made Teresa feel completely safe. Giving it away meant surrendering more than warmth. It meant letting go of home. She closed her eyes. Then she began walking. The young mother looked up as Teresa approached. Fear flashed across her face. "I'm sorry," the woman said quickly. "We're not bothering anyone." "I know. We'll leave if someone asks." "You don't have to." Teresa slowly knelt beside her. Only then did she see the baby's face clearly. His cheeks had turned pale. His tiny lips carried a faint, bluish tint. His little fingers barely moved. "How old is he?" Teresa asked softly. 3 months. "What's his name?" "Ethan." The mother tried to smile. "It means strong." Teresa looked into the baby's half-open eyes. Strong wasn't the word she would have chosen. He looked exhausted, as if even crying required too much energy. "What happened?" Teresa asked. The young woman hesitated. "My car broke down outside Joliet." She swallowed hard. "I sold it for scrap yesterday just to pay hospital bills." Teresa listened quietly. "My sister was supposed to pick us up tonight." "Did she come?" Rachel shook her head. "She lost her job last week." A tear slid down her cheek. "I didn't want to ask anyone else." Teresa understood that sentence better than anyone. Sometimes pride wasn't arrogance. Sometimes it was the last thing poverty allowed a person to keep. "Have you eaten?" Rachel gave a tiny laugh. "I bought baby formula." She looked down. "I figured adults can skip meals." Teresa reached into her backpack and found the paper bag from the diner. Inside were 2 slightly stale dinner rolls she had forgotten. "They're not fresh," Teresa said, "but they still taste okay." Rachel stared at them as though they were a feast. "I can't take those." "You can. You need them too. I'll find breakfast." It wasn't true, but it sounded believable enough. Rachel accepted the rolls with trembling hands. Before taking a bite, she broke off a small piece and gently touched it to Ethan's lips. The gesture pierced Teresa's heart. Even starving herself, this mother thought of her child first. Teresa looked again at the navy blanket wrapped tightly around her own shoulders. Without giving herself another chance to reconsider, she untied it. Cold air instantly wrapped around her body. Rachel's eyes widened. No. Teresa unfolded the blanket carefully. Its deep blue fabric seemed almost luminous beneath the station lights. You need this. Rachel shook her head violently. I can't. You can. It's yours. For tonight, Teresa smiled gently. It belongs to him. She leaned forward and wrapped the blanket around baby Ethan. The thick wool covered him almost completely. Within seconds, his tiny body stopped trembling. Rachel burst into tears. I don't even know your name. Teresa. I'm Rachel. Their hands met briefly. Ice-cold fingers against equally frozen skin. Rachel noticed the golden thread stitched into one corner. What happened here? My grandmother repaired it years ago. She traced the tiny star with one finger. She always said nothing valuable has to be perfect. Rachel smiled through tears. I'll never forget this. You don't have to remember me. Teresa gently adjusted the blanket around Ethan's shoulders. Just remember what my grandmother used to say. Rachel waited. Teresa looked down at the baby. Warmth is something you pass on. The words hung quietly between them. Neither woman realized how far they would travel over the next 20 years. Just then, Ethan stirred. His tiny hand slipped out from beneath the blanket. His fingers wrapped around Teresa's index finger with surprising strength. For one brief moment, he held on. Teresa laughed softly. Looks like he's already stronger than he looks. Rachel laughed too. It was the first genuine laugh either woman had shared that night. Minutes later, a volunteer from a nearby church entered the station carrying hot coffee and emergency supplies after responding to reports of stranded travelers. Seeing the baby now wrapped securely in thick wool, the volunteer hurried over. Within the hour, Rachel and Ethan were taken to a temporary family shelter where they would spend the rest of the storm. Before leaving, Rachel reluctantly folded back one small, torn corner of the blanket. The fabric had ripped slightly while she hurriedly wrapped Ethan. I'm so sorry, she whispered. Teresa smiled. It's only cloth. But Rachel quietly cut away the loose, damaged corner before carefully sewing the edge closed with a small travel sewing kit she carried. She slipped that tiny triangle of navy fabric into her coat pocket. One day she told herself she would return it to the woman who had saved her son. Neither of them knew that life had already begun writing a different ending. Teresa remained alone inside Union Station after they left. The cold returned almost immediately. She folded her arms tightly across her chest and watched the automatic doors close behind Rachel and baby Ethan. For the first time all night, she realized she no longer had anything to keep herself warm. The warmth disappeared faster than Teresa expected. For the first few minutes after Rachel and baby Ethan left with the church volunteers, adrenaline kept the cold at bay. Teresa remained seated on the wooden bench, rubbing her hands together, and telling herself the hardest part of the night was over. She was wrong. By 3 o'clock in the morning, every breath burned her lungs. The marble floor seemed to radiate cold through the soles of her worn sneakers. Her fingertips had become so numb that she struggled to unzip her backpack. She put on every piece of clothing she owned: a faded sweatshirt, a second pair of socks, a thin flannel shirt over her sweater. It wasn't enough. She walked slowly through the station to keep her body moving, circling the waiting hall again and again. Security guards noticed her, but assumed she was simply another traveler waiting for an early train. No one realized she had nowhere to go. Around 4:30, the station cafe opened. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the air. Teresa reached into her wallet. $18.43. She stared at the bills for several long seconds before putting them away. That money had to last. Coffee would warm her for 20 minutes. Keeping the money might help her survive the week. She chose the week. Instead, she filled a paper cup with hot water from a public dispenser and wrapped both hands around it. It helped a little. Not much. As dawn slowly painted the sky gray beyond the station windows, Teresa finally stepped outside. The storm had weakened, but the wind had grown sharper. Every gust felt like tiny needles striking her face. She walked toward a nearby church she remembered passing months earlier while delivering catering orders from the diner. She wasn't even sure it would be open. Halfway there, her legs began to shake uncontrollably. She tried to ignore it. Just keep walking. One more block, then another. People hurried past wearing thick winter coats. Some carried briefcases. Others carried shopping bags. No one noticed the young woman stumbling through the snow with a faded backpack hanging from one shoulder. She reached the church steps shortly after 7. The wooden doors were still closed. Teresa sat down to wait. She leaned against one of the stone columns. For just a moment, she allowed herself to close her eyes. The next thing she heard was a distant voice. "Ma'am?" She didn't answer. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Someone touched her shoulder gently. Her eyelids felt impossibly heavy. When she finally opened them, an older man wearing a thick black coat was kneeling beside her. "I'm Pastor Samuel Green." His face was lined with age, but his eyes held the quiet kindness of someone who had spent a lifetime listening to other people's pain. "I think you need to come inside." Teresa tried to stand. Her knees gave way immediately. Pastor Green caught her before she hit the ground. I'm okay," she whispered. He smiled gently. "No. You've simply been strong for too long." Those words broke something inside her. Not because they were dramatic, because they were true. Within minutes, volunteers guided Teresa into the church basement. The room smelled of vegetable soup, fresh bread, and laundry detergent. Someone placed a steaming bowl in front of her. Another volunteer wrapped a donated quilt around her shoulders. A nurse from the congregation checked her temperature. One look at the thermometer made the nurse frown. "She's running a high fever." Teresa tried to protest. "I'll be fine." The nurse shook her head. "No, you won't." By afternoon, she was lying in a charity clinic with pneumonia. The doctor explained that prolonged exposure to freezing temperatures had pushed her body beyond its limits. "You came in just in time," he said quietly. "A few more hours outside." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The following days blurred together. Antibiotics, warm blankets, interrupted sleep, coughing fits that left her exhausted. She kept apologizing to everyone who helped her. "I'm sorry to be a burden." Pastor Green finally laughed one morning while bringing her breakfast. "You've apologized 7 times since sunrise." Teresa looked embarrassed. "I just don't like needing help." He pulled up a chair. "Can I tell you something?" She nodded. "I've watched people donate thousands of dollars without ever looking into another person's eyes." He paused. "And I've watched people with almost nothing share the little they had." He looked directly at her. "I know which one changes the world." Teresa lowered her gaze. "I only gave away a blanket." Pastor Green smiled. "No. You gave away your only blanket." The difference settled quietly between them. For the first time since leaving Calvin, Teresa cried without trying to hide it, not because she felt defeated, because someone had finally understood what the blanket had truly cost. She remained at the clinic for nearly 3 weeks. Once she recovered enough to work, Pastor Green introduced her to the church's employment coordinator. The opportunities weren't glamorous. A hotel needed overnight housekeeping staff. A school cafeteria needed temporary kitchen workers. An office building wanted evening cleaners. Teresa accepted the first job offered before even asking about the pay. She had learned something important. Dignity wasn't found in the title on a name badge. It was found in showing up every day with honesty. Months turned into years. She worked wherever work was available. Hotels, schools, office buildings. Eventually, after building a reputation for reliability, she was hired by the maintenance contractor, responsible for cleaning government facilities. That single opportunity changed the course of her life. She rented a tiny studio apartment on the South Side. She bought second-hand furniture one piece at a time. A small table, a reading lamp, a kettle, a rocking chair from a thrift store that squeaked every time she leaned back. She never bought another blanket as beautiful as the one Eleanor had left her. Sometimes she considered searching for Rachel and baby Ethan. She knew only their first names. No address, no phone number, no last name. Chicago held millions of people. Finding them felt impossible. Still, every winter, whenever snow covered the sidewalks, Teresa found herself wondering, did the little boy survive? Was he healthy? Did he grow up feeling loved? Did Rachel ever find the life she had dreamed about? She would never know. Or so she believed. One December evening, nearly 20 years later, Teresa finished polishing the marble floor inside Cook County Courthouse. She straightened a row of chairs outside Courtroom 4B before quietly emptying a trash bin. A young attorney in a dark navy suit walked past, carrying several case files. He slowed just long enough to smile politely. "Good evening, ma'am." "Good evening." Their conversation lasted barely 3 seconds. Neither recognized the other. Teresa saw only another hard-working lawyer. Ethan Mitchell saw only the courthouse janitor who always kept the hallways spotless. Both continued walking in opposite directions. Neither could imagine that fate had just reunited them after 2 decades. And neither knew that before Christmas arrived, one would stand accused of a crime, while the other would be responsible for proving it. By the spring of 2026, Teresa Howard had become part of the courthouse in a way few people noticed. She arrived every weekday at exactly 5:45 a.m., 20 minutes before her shift officially began. The security officers at the employee entrance knew her well. "Morning, Miss Howard," Officer Luis Ramirez would call as he scanned her badge. "Morning, Luis. How's your granddaughter?" "Started kindergarten yesterday." Teresa smiled. "Tell her the first week is always the hardest." She remembered details about nearly everyone. Which clerk was studying for the bar exam? Which bailiff's wife had recently recovered from surgery? Which court reporter always skipped breakfast unless someone reminded her? She never considered these things extraordinary. To her, remembering people was another way of respecting them. Every morning followed the same quiet routine. She filled her old blue thermos with coffee made in the maintenance room. She tied her gray work apron over her navy uniform. She placed fresh trash liners into her cleaning cart. Before beginning, she always paused in the empty main hallway. Sunlight streamed through the courthouse's tall windows, stretching across the polished marble floor. Teresa would look at the reflection for a brief moment and whisper the same words. "Thank you for another day." Then she went to work. Most employees barely noticed the floors that never seemed dirty, the windows without fingerprints, or the conference rooms that somehow looked perfect before every meeting. That invisibility never bothered Teresa anymore. She had learned years ago that meaningful work often disappeared behind its own success. If people never noticed the cleaning, it usually meant she had done it well. Around 8 each morning, attorneys began filling the hallways. Dark suits, leather briefcases, fast footsteps, important conversations. Among them was one lawyer who always caught Teresa's attention. Assistant District Attorney Ethan Mitchell. At 23, he had become one of the youngest prosecutors in the office to receive responsibility for complex financial crime cases. People admired his sharp mind. Some feared his relentless preparation. Others quietly complained that he expected honesty from everyone because he demanded it from himself first. He wasn't arrogant. He simply believed rules mattered. On most mornings, Ethan carried too many files and drank coffee that had long since gone cold. He moved quickly, but never rudely. Unlike many attorneys, he always acknowledged courthouse staff. "Good morning, Miss Howard." "Morning, Mr. Mitchell." "Thank you for keeping this place running." She usually answered with the same gentle smile. "We all have our jobs." Neither conversation lasted more than a few seconds. Yet over several years, those small greetings became an unspoken ritual. One rainy Tuesday, Ethan hurried around a corner while reviewing notes for an afternoon hearing. He never saw the mop bucket. His foot slipped. The stack of folders exploded across the polished hallway. Hundreds of pages scattered everywhere. Several lawyers walked around the mess without slowing down. One even muttered impatiently. Teresa immediately set aside her cleaning supplies. "Oh dear, I'm so sorry," Ethan said, kneeling quickly. "My fault," Teresa replied. "The floor was still damp." For the next several minutes, the prosecutor and the janitor quietly gathered documents together. Ethan looked embarrassed. "I probably should stop reading while walking." Teresa chuckled. "That would certainly make my job easier." He laughed. It was a genuine laugh, the kind that arrived unexpectedly after a stressful morning. As they organized the final folder, Teresa noticed a photograph tucked between legal papers. A smiling woman stood beside a teenage Ethan at what appeared to be a lakeside park. His mother. "You have her smile," Teresa said without thinking. Ethan looked at the picture. "I've been told that." "You must be close." His expression softened. "We were." The past tense didn't escape Teresa. "I'm sorry." He carefully returned the photograph to his folder. "She passed away last year." There was no dramatic pause, no visible tears, only a quiet sadness that seemed well practiced. "She raised me by herself." "I'm sure she was proud of you." Ethan smiled faintly. "I hope so." For reasons neither of them could explain, that brief conversation stayed with both of them for the rest of the day. Late that afternoon, Teresa entered courtroom 7A after everyone had left. She straightened chairs, emptied wastebaskets, and noticed a forgotten fountain pen lying beneath the judge's bench. Instead of placing it in lost and found, immediately she walked 3 floors upstairs to return it personally. It belonged to Judge Harold Bennett. The elderly judge accepted it with a grateful smile. "Most people wouldn't have bothered." Teresa shrugged. "It wasn't mine." Judge Bennett nodded thoughtfully. "I've learned that's becoming a rare sentence." As Teresa left his office, the judge watched her disappear down the hallway. He had presided over thousands of cases during 4 decades on the bench. He believed character revealed itself through tiny decisions long before life's biggest tests arrived. Teresa reminded him of that truth. Elsewhere in the building, another story had already begun unfolding. Inside the Records and Evidence Division, Daniel Brooks unlocked a secure archive room using his supervisor's access card. He checked both directions before quietly entering. His movements were practiced, confident, almost routine. He removed a thick case file from a locked cabinet and replaced it with an identical folder prepared in advance. Anyone glancing quickly would never notice the difference. Inside the replacement folder, however, several critical financial documents had disappeared. Daniel closed the cabinet. He glanced once toward the ceiling camera, then smiled. He already knew the camera would never become a problem. Earlier that week, he had convinced an outside contractor to perform maintenance on the security system. A few carefully edited minutes would soon disappear forever. The missing evidence involved a multi-million-dollar corruption investigation tied to several influential business figures. If the original records vanished permanently, the prosecution could collapse. Daniel wasn't acting alone, but he was the only person inside the courthouse willing to take the risk. The following morning, courthouse employees arrived as usual. Nothing looked different. The floors shined, coffee brewed, elevators filled with lawyers. Judges reviewed calendars. Teresa polished brass railings outside the archive hallway without realizing that less than 20 feet away, a crime had already been committed. At exactly 9:12 a.m., an evidence clerk unlocked Cabinet 14. Within seconds, panic spread through the records office. "The original file is gone." Supervisors rushed into the room. Phones began ringing. Security officers sealed the hallway. Employees were instructed not to leave their work areas. Teresa watched from a distance as yellow evidence markers appeared near the archive entrance. She quietly moved her cleaning cart aside to keep the corridor clear. Officer Ramirez approached. "Miss Howard, we're going to need everyone who worked this floor yesterday to stay available for questions." "Of course." She answered without hesitation. She had nothing to hide. Across the building, Ethan Mitchell received a phone call from the chief prosecutor. "I've got a new assignment for you." "What happened?" "A major evidence theft." There was a long pause. Then came the sentence that would alter both his life and Teresa's forever. "Someone inside this courthouse may have betrayed the justice system." The courthouse no longer sounded the same. Normally, its hallways echoed with hurried conversations, the clicking of polished shoes and the steady rhythm of elevators opening and closing. By mid-morning, those familiar sounds had been replaced with lowered voices, hurried phone calls, and the unmistakable tension that spread whenever trust had been broken. No one wanted to say it aloud. If evidence could disappear from inside Cook County Courthouse, then anyone working there could become a suspect. Teresa quietly parked her cleaning cart against the wall as investigators sealed the records and evidence division with bright yellow tape. Employees gathered in small clusters exchanging theories. It had to be someone with access. Maybe it was an outside hacker. I heard millions of dollars are involved. Teresa listened without adding a word. Rumors, she believed, rarely helped anyone. At 10:30 a.m., Detective Marcus Reed arrived with the courthouse's internal investigations unit. Unlike television detectives, Marcus wasn't dramatic. He carried a plain notebook instead of barking orders. He greeted people politely before asking questions. He believed nervousness wasn't proof of guilt. Everyone became nervous when accused of something they didn't understand. One by one, employees were interviewed. Court clerks, security officers, maintenance workers, evidence technicians. When Teresa's turn came, Marcus gestured toward a small conference room. "Please have a seat, Miss Howard." She folded her hands calmly in her lap. Marcus opened a file. "You've worked here almost 18 years. 17 years and 8 months. He nodded, making a note. "Yesterday afternoon, were you cleaning the 4th floor?" "Yes." "Between 3 and 4 o'clock?" "I was." "Did you enter the archive hallway?" "I emptied the trash cans outside the records office." "Did you enter the secured room?" "No." "Did anyone speak with you?" Teresa thought carefully. "A clerk asked where the restroom was." "Anyone else?" "I saw Mr. Brooks carrying several file boxes." Marcus looked up. "Daniel Brooks." "I believe so." "Anything unusual?" "He looked rushed." Marcus wrote the answer down. It wasn't much, but neither of them realized it would matter later. The interview lasted less than 15 minutes. As Teresa stood to leave, Marcus said quietly, "For what it's worth, you've got an excellent reputation." She smiled faintly. "I appreciate that. But reputations aren't evidence." Marcus didn't answer, because she was right. By lunchtime, technicians had finished reviewing the building's surveillance footage. The head of courthouse security entered the investigation room carrying a tablet. "We've got something." Several people gathered around. The video showed the 4th floor hallway at 3:27 p.m. There was Teresa. Her gray maintenance cart rolled slowly past the archive entrance. She paused, looked toward the records office, then disappeared briefly from the camera's view. 43 seconds later, she reappeared and continued down the hallway. Someone froze the image. What happened during those 43 seconds? No one knew. The camera angle didn't cover the doorway itself. Marcus frowned. Is there another camera? There should be. Should. The second camera stopped recording during scheduled maintenance. Marcus's expression hardened. When exactly? Yesterday. He didn't like coincidences. Still, the footage placed Teresa closer to the missing evidence than anyone else currently identified. An hour later, Teresa was called back. This time, Ethan Mitchell sat beside Marcus. It was the first time they had ever spoken for more than a minute. Ethan closed the file in front of him. Miss Howard. Mr. Mitchell. His voice remained respectful. We're trying to establish everyone's movements yesterday. I understand. The security video shows you stopping outside the archive room. Yes. Why? Teresa answered immediately. My trash bag tore. Marcus looked up. It did. I bent down to pick up coffee cups that fell onto the floor. How long? I don't know. Less than a minute. Ethan studied her face. She never looked away, never hesitated. People often imagined that lying required confidence. Years as a prosecutor had taught him the opposite. Most lies rushed forward. Truth usually paused to remember. What happened afterward? I replaced the trash bag and continued working. Yes. Marcus slid a photograph across the table. It showed Teresa's cleaning cart parked near the archive entrance. Does this refresh your memory? She examined it. It looks right. You still deny entering the archive room. I don't deny it. Both men looked surprised. Teresa continued calmly. I know I never entered. Silence settled over the room. Ethan leaned back. There was something unusual about her answers. She never became defensive. She simply described what she remembered. Marcus thanked her. You may return to work for now. For now. Those two words lingered in Teresa's mind. Outside the conference room, employees stopped talking as she walked past. Some smiled awkwardly. Others avoided eye contact completely. News traveled faster than elevators. By late afternoon, nearly everyone knew investigators had questioned the janitor twice. The whispers began. I heard they have video. Really? They wouldn't question her again otherwise? I always thought she seemed too quiet. Teresa kept walking. She had lived long enough to understand how quickly kindness disappeared when fear entered a room. Only Linda Foster refused to change. Linda had supervised the maintenance staff for nearly 10 years. She found Teresa replacing supplies in a storage closet. You holding up? I'm trying. Linda crossed her arms. I don't believe you stole anything. Teresa smiled gently. Thank you. But believing isn't the same as proving. Linda sighed. I know. She lowered her voice. If they suspend you, I'll understand. No. Linda shook her head firmly. I won't. Before Teresa could respond, another employee appeared at the doorway. The chief administrator wants Miss Howard upstairs. Linda's shoulders dropped. She already knew what that meant. The meeting lasted exactly 12 minutes. When Teresa emerged, she carried a plain white envelope. Inside was a temporary suspension notice pending the outcome of the investigation. She quietly removed her employee identification badge. The administrator avoided meeting her eyes. This isn't a determination of guilt. I know. It's standard procedure. I understand. She truly did. Policies existed for reasons. Even fair policies could still hurt innocent people. As Teresa walked toward the employee exit carrying her backpack, Officer Luis Ramirez intercepted her. I just heard. She nodded. It'll get sorted out. I hope so. He hesitated before speaking again. My granddaughter still talks about the coloring book you bought her. Teresa smiled. It was only $5. Luis shook his head. No. It was the fact that you remembered her birthday. For the first time that day, Teresa felt tears threaten to appear. Not because she had been suspended, because one simple reminder told her that years of quiet kindness hadn't been invisible after all. She blinked the tears away. Outside, cold rain had replaced the morning sunshine. Teresa stood beneath the courthouse steps holding the white envelope. The same building she had helped care for nearly every day for 18 years now felt strangely distant. Across the street, Ethan watched from his office window. He should have been reviewing evidence. Instead, he found himself watching the courthouse janitor slowly open an old umbrella with 2 broken ribs before disappearing into the rain. Something about the scene refused to leave him. Every piece of evidence pointed toward Teresa Howard, yet the woman walking away looked less like someone escaping justice and more like someone carrying a burden she had never chosen. The file landed on Ethan Mitchell's desk at exactly 7:12 the next morning. Across the front, in bold black letters, someone had stamped Internal Evidence Theft, Primary Suspect, Teresa Howard. Ethan stared at the folder for several seconds before opening it. The case looked straightforward. A classified corruption file had disappeared. The security footage placed Teresa Howard outside the archive room. She had no witness confirming what she did during the missing 43 seconds. No signs of forced entry had been found. The records office required employee access. Everything pointed inward. Everything pointed toward her. Still, something bothered him. He couldn't explain what it was. He simply couldn't picture Teresa Howard risking 18 years of honest work for reasons no one had yet identified. He began reading every page. Interview transcripts, security reports, camera still photographs, maintenance schedules, evidence inventory logs. At first glance, the investigation appeared thorough. By the second reading, tiny inconsistencies began to surface. One report stated that the archive room had been locked continuously from 3:15 until after 4:00. Another report showed Daniel Brooks using his supervisor keycard at 3:11. A clerk claimed no one entered afterward. Yet the electronic access log recorded another entry at 3:34. No explanation had been attached. Ethan highlighted the discrepancy. Then another, and another. He leaned back. Either someone had made careless mistakes, or someone expected nobody to read carefully. His phone rang. Mitchell? Chief Prosecutor Diane Collins spoke without greeting. I need charges prepared by tomorrow. Tomorrow. The media already knows someone inside the courthouse is responsible. We're still reviewing the evidence. The evidence is sufficient. Ethan glanced towards the highlighted reports. I'd like another day. You don't have another day. She lowered her voice. Confidence in this courthouse is already damaged. The public needs to see action. After the call ended, Ethan remained motionless. He understood political pressure. Public trust mattered. But speed and certainty weren't always the same thing. Around noon, he requested another interview with Teresa. This time they met in a smaller conference room. No detectives, no supervisors, only a recorder on the table. Teresa entered, wearing the same navy sweater she had worn beneath her maintenance uniform. Without the gray apron and identification badge, she somehow looked smaller, more vulnerable. Thank you for coming, Ethan said. You asked. She sat quietly. I wanted to ask a few questions personally. Of course. He opened his notebook. Have you ever been disciplined during your employment? No. Any financial difficulties? She smiled faintly. I've had those most of my life. I meant debts. No loans. No credit cards. No gambling. No. No recent large purchases. My refrigerator stopped working 3 months ago. I bought a used one. For $200. She answered every question without irritation. Nothing felt rehearsed. Finally, Ethan asked the question that had been lingering in his mind. If you didn't take the file, who do you think did? Teresa surprised him by shaking her head. I don't know. You've worked there almost 18 years. I clean offices. I don't judge people. Surely you've noticed something. I've noticed everyone is scared. She folded her hands. When people become frightened, they stop seeing each other clearly. Ethan looked at her. What do you mean? They stop asking what happened. She paused. And start asking who to blame? The room fell silent. She wasn't arguing. She wasn't pleading. She was simply describing what she had experienced. Ethan closed the notebook. Can I ask something unrelated? She nodded. Why did you stay at the courthouse so long? She seemed surprised by the question. Because it mattered. The work. The people. She smiled softly. When judges make difficult decisions, someone should make sure the courtroom is clean before they arrive. When families come looking for justice, someone should empty the trash before they sit down. It may not seem important. I think it is. Those words lingered long after the interview ended. As Teresa left, Ethan watched her disappear down the hallway. She walked slowly, but not like someone defeated. More like someone carrying disappointment with quiet dignity. Later that afternoon, Ethan met Detective Marcus Reed inside the security office. Marcus spread several photographs across the table. I've been reviewing camera angles. Find anything? Maybe. He pointed toward a floor plan. This hallway camera shows Teresa stopping. Right. But this maintenance camera across the intersection catches only reflections. Ethan leaned closer. Inside the polished glass of a display cabinet, a faint figure could be seen moving farther down the hallway. Marcus enlarged the image. The quality became grainy. Still? There. A man carrying 2 archive boxes. The timestamp matched almost exactly. Who's that? Marcus zoomed again. The face remained blurred, but the posture, the height, the haircut, it looked remarkably similar to Daniel Brooks. It isn't enough, Marcus admitted. No jury would identify anyone from this. But it tells us Teresa wasn't the only person there. Ethan nodded slowly. Can we recover the original footage? Marcus sighed. The recording system overwrote part of it after maintenance. What kind of maintenance? Funny thing. Marcus slid over another document. The contractor says nobody requested maintenance that day. Ethan looked up immediately. What? The work order appears to be fake. Neither man spoke. The room suddenly felt much quieter. Someone hadn't merely stolen evidence. Someone had planned every step in advance. Across town, Daniel Brooks sat inside his spacious office, reviewing financial spreadsheets. His phone vibrated. A single text message appeared. Investigation continuing. Brooks frowned. It should have been over already. Everything had pointed toward the janitor. Why were prosecutors still digging? He deleted the message immediately, then opened a locked drawer. Inside lay a flash drive no larger than a stick of gum. On it rested copies of the missing financial records. Insurance. If anyone tried blaming him, he still had leverage. He smiled. No one would ever suspect the respected archive supervisor. Back at the courthouse, Ethan remained in his office after sunset. Stacks of documents covered every available surface. Most prosecutors would have begun drafting charges. Instead, Ethan kept rereading Teresa Howard's employment file. 18 years. Perfect evaluations. Letters of appreciation. Volunteer work at winter shelters. Commendations for returning lost property. One report described how she had once found an envelope containing nearly $4,000 in cash outside a courtroom. She had turned it in untouched. The owner later wrote that the money had been intended for his daughter's emergency surgery. Another letter came from Judge Harold Bennett. It contained only one sentence. If integrity had a face, it would look remarkably like Teresa Howard. Ethan placed the letter down. He looked through his office window toward the now empty courthouse parking lot. Something no longer fit. Evidence could be manufactured. Video could be edited. Access logs could be manipulated. But 18 years of consistent character, that was much harder to fake. For the first time since receiving the case, Ethan allowed himself to consider a possibility he had been resisting. Perhaps Teresa Howard wasn't the person he needed to prosecute. Perhaps she was the person someone desperately wanted him to believe was guilty. Monday morning arrived beneath a sky the color of wet concrete. By 8 o'clock, television news vans had already lined the street outside Cook County Courthouse. Reporters stood behind microphones rehearsing introductions, while camera operators adjusted their lenses toward the courthouse entrance. The story had grown far beyond a missing case file. The public now believed that someone inside one of Chicago's most respected courthouses had betrayed the justice system. People wanted someone to blame. Few cared whether they blamed the right person. Teresa stepped out of a city bus carrying the same faded canvas backpack she had owned for nearly 20 years. She had pressed her navy blouse carefully the night before. Although she was no longer allowed to wear her maintenance uniform, she still polished her shoes until they reflected the morning light. Dignity, she often reminded herself, was one thing no accusation could take away. As she climbed the courthouse steps, reporters immediately recognized her. "Miss Howard, did you steal the evidence? Who paid you? Do you regret what you've done?" Microphones appeared inches from her face. Camera shutters clicked rapidly. Teresa stopped for only a moment. She looked at the crowd without anger. "I hope the truth speaks louder than rumors." Then she quietly continued inside. Several reporters looked at one another. That wasn't the answer they expected. Inside the building, familiar hallways suddenly felt unfamiliar. Some employees smiled sympathetically. Others quickly looked away. A few whispered as she passed. Teresa understood. Fear made ordinary people cautious. She refused to resent them for it. Courtroom 4B slowly filled with attorneys, journalists, courthouse employees, and curious members of the public. Judge Harold Bennett entered precisely at 9. His silver hair and calm expression carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades separating emotion from evidence. The courtroom rose, then sat again. Ethan Mitchell organized his files with practiced precision. His suit looked immaculate. His notes had been reviewed 3 separate times, yet something inside him remained unsettled. Across the room, Teresa sat beside her court-appointed defense attorney, Melissa Grant. Melissa leaned closer. "If you're nervous, that's perfectly normal." Teresa smiled gently. "I am. But not about the truth." Melissa looked at her for a long moment. In 22 years of practicing law, she had represented frightened people, dishonest people, desperate people, and occasionally dangerous people. Teresa didn't resemble any of them. Judge Bennett adjusted his glasses. "We are here regarding allegations involving the unlawful removal of protected evidence from the Records and Evidence Division." He turned toward Ethan. "Mr. Mitchell." Ethan stood. He began exactly as every prosecutor was trained to begin: measured, professional, objective. He summarized the missing file. The security footage, the access records, the timeline. Every sentence was factually correct. Yet as he spoke, he found himself carefully avoiding language that implied certainty beyond what the evidence actually established. Judge Bennett noticed. So did Melissa Grant. When Ethan finished, Melissa rose for the defense. My client has served this courthouse faithfully for nearly 18 years. She has no criminal history. No financial motive has been established. And the current evidence leaves significant unanswered questions. She did not argue dramatically. She simply pointed toward uncertainty. The judge nodded thoughtfully. Witnesses. The first witness was the head of courthouse security. He described discovering the missing file. Then came the surveillance technician. He explained the 43-second gap in Teresa's recorded movements. Finally, Detective Marcus Reed testified regarding the initial investigation. Melissa approached him during cross-examination. Detective Reed. Yes? Would you describe Miss Howard as cooperative? Yes. Did she attempt to flee? No. Did she refuse questioning? No. Did she request an attorney before answering basic questions? No. Marcus answered calmly. Melissa continued. Has any stolen property been found in her possession? No. Has any money connected to this theft been found? No. Have investigators identified a motive? Marcus hesitated. No. The hesitation echoed through the courtroom. Melissa returned to her seat. No dramatic objections, no theatrical speeches, only silence. During a brief recess, Teresa walked into the nearly empty hallway to get a cup of water. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the paper cup. Not from fear, from exhaustion. Someone approached quietly. It was Linda Foster. The maintenance supervisor wrapped both hands around Teresa's shoulders. You look tired. I didn't sleep much. Linda smiled sadly. Neither did I. She reached into her purse. I brought you something. Inside a small paper bag rested a turkey sandwich and an apple. You'll need lunch. Teresa's eyes filled with tears. I can't take your food. Linda laughed softly. You've shared yours with enough people over the years. Now let somebody share theirs. Teresa accepted the bag with both hands. Thank you. Linda squeezed her arm. No. Thank you. Before Teresa could ask why, Linda returned quietly to the courtroom. The words lingered in Teresa's mind. Back inside, the hearing resumed. Melissa called only one witness, Teresa Howard. She walked slowly toward the witness stand, raised her right hand, swore to tell the truth, then sat down. Melissa's questions were simple. How long have you worked at this courthouse? Nearly 18 years. Why did you stay? Teresa smiled faintly. Because I believed the work mattered. What do you mean? I've always thought justice deserves clean floors. A few people in the gallery smiled. Not because the answer was amusing, because it sounded unmistakably sincere. Melissa continued. Did you remove any evidence from the archive room? No. Did you help anyone else remove it? No. Did anyone ever ask you to? No. Then came the final question. If convicted, what concerns you most? The courtroom expected Teresa to mention prison, or losing her pension, or her reputation. Instead, she answered quietly. I worry that people I've worked beside for 82 years will begin believing kindness is weakness. The room became still. She looked toward the jury. I've spent most of my life cleaning up after strangers. I never thought one day I'd have to defend my own name from them. She paused. But even now, her voice remained calm. I don't hate anyone sitting in this courtroom. Judge Bennett watched her carefully. So did Ethan. Teresa continued. I grew up believing that a person's circumstances can change overnight. You can lose your job. You can lose your home. You can lose your health. She folded her hands together. But if you lose your integrity, it's much harder to find again. No one spoke. The silence carried more weight than applause ever could. Ethan found himself looking down at his own notes. He had prepared dozens of follow-up questions. Suddenly, they felt strangely inadequate, because nothing Teresa had said sounded rehearsed. Nothing sounded calculated. It sounded like someone describing the only way she knew how to live. As the judge announced another short recess before closing arguments, Ethan remained seated. His eyes drifted toward Teresa. She quietly opened the paper bag Linda had given her. Before taking a bite of the sandwich, she noticed an elderly courthouse visitor sitting alone nearby, looking weak and confused. Without hesitation, Teresa stood, walked over, and handed the entire sandwich to the stranger. She kept only the apple for herself. Ethan watched every second of it. No cameras recorded the moment. No reporters noticed. No jury members were close enough to see. There was no audience to impress. Only one simple act of generosity performed by a woman standing trial for a crime she insisted she had never committed. For reasons he couldn't fully explain, that quiet moment unsettled Ethan more than every piece of evidence inside the case file. That evening, long after the courthouse had emptied, only a handful of office lights still glowed against the Chicago skyline. Ethan Mitchell remained alone in his office. The transcript from the morning hearing lay open on his desk, but he hadn't turned a page in nearly 20 minutes. Instead, he kept replaying one small moment in his mind. Not Teresa's testimony, not the arguments, the sandwich. She had been standing trial, uncertain whether she would lose everything she had spent nearly 2 decades building. Yet the first thing she did when she finally had food in her hands was to give it to someone who looked hungrier than she was. There had been no cameras, no reporters, no applause, just instinct. Ethan had spent years learning that criminals often pretended to be compassionate when someone was watching. Teresa hadn't known anyone was. His phone vibrated. Marcus Reed. "I found something." "I'm on my way." 20 minutes later, Ethan entered the Internal Investigations office. Marcus stood beside a wall covered with photographs, access logs, and enlarged security stills connected by colored strings. It looked chaotic. Marcus smiled. "It looked simpler yesterday." "What changed?" "You." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You asked me to stop looking for confirmation." Marcus handed him a cup of coffee. "And start looking for contradictions." He pointed toward a digital timeline projected onto the wall. "Watch this." The screen displayed every electronic keycard used on the 4th floor that afternoon. 3:11 p.m. Daniel Brooks entered the archive room. 3:18. A records clerk entered. 3:24. The clerk exited. 3:27. Teresa appeared in the hallway with her cleaning cart. 3:34. Someone used a supervisor access card again. Marcus paused the video. "Notice anything?" Ethan leaned closer. Teresa is still visible at the end of the hallway." Marcus nodded. "So she couldn't have been the one using the supervisor card." "Exactly. But whose card was it?" Marcus pulled another document from the file. "Officially, Daniel Brooks's. Unofficially," Marcus spread several maintenance schedules across the table. "His keycard was supposedly locked inside his office drawer." Ethan frowned. "Supposedly?" Marcus slid over a witness statement. "The office assistant says Brooks asked for his spare key that afternoon. He claimed he'd forgotten his own." "So both cards were active?" Marcus nodded. "For nearly 40 minutes. Silence settled between them. 2 active supervisor cards. 1 archive room, 1 missing file. This wasn't a coincidence anymore. Ethan crossed his arms. "Can we prove who held the second card?" Marcus shook his head. "Not yet. But we're getting closer." Across town, Daniel Brooks sat inside his quiet suburban home. His wife watched television upstairs while he remained alone in the basement. The flash drive still rested inside a small, fireproof safe. He opened it. Not because he needed anything, because anxiety had become stronger than confidence. He plugged the drive into his laptop. Every copied document remained exactly where he had left it. He exhaled. Then his phone rang. A private number. Yes. A distorted voice spoke quietly. They're still investigating. I know. You said the janitor would take the fall. She will. You sound less certain. Daniel's jaw tightened. I'm handling it. The call ended. Daniel stared at the dark screen for several long seconds. For the first time since stealing the file, fear entered the room. Back at the courthouse, Ethan and Marcus continued comparing reports. Marcus suddenly stopped flipping pages. Wait. He pulled out Teresa's original interview. Read this. Ethan read aloud. I saw Mr. Brooks carrying several file boxes. Marcus nodded. She volunteered that information before anyone asked specifically about Brooks. So, if she were trying to frame him, she would have emphasized it. Marcus smiled. Exactly. Instead, she almost apologized for mentioning him. Ethan remembered the conversation. She hadn't accused anyone. She had simply answered honestly. That difference mattered. Marcus walked toward the evidence board again. You know what keeps bothering me? What? The missing 43 seconds. Ethan looked at the screen. What about them? Marcus pointed toward Teresa's cleaning cart. Everyone assumes she disappeared into the archive. What if she didn't? He enlarged another frame. Near the bottom corner, barely visible, a torn black trash bag lay beside the cart. Ethan's eyes widened. She told us the bag ripped. Marcus nodded slowly. And there it is. The timestamp matched perfectly. For weeks, investigators had dismissed Teresa's explanation because they believed there was no proof. Now there it was. Tiny, almost invisible, but real. Ethan felt something shift inside him. Not certainty, hope. If the trash bag really tore, then she wasn't inventing the story. Marcus folded his arms. Which means we've been asking the wrong question. What should we be asking? Marcus answered without hesitation. If Teresa didn't steal the file, who benefited from everyone believing she did? Meanwhile, Teresa sat alone inside her small apartment. Rain tapped softly against the living room window. She had turned off the television after seeing her own photograph on the evening news. Instead, she made herself a simple dinner. Vegetable soup, 2 slices of bread, an apple. The apartment remained modest after all these years. The squeaky rocking chair, the second-hand bookshelf, the kettle she had owned for over a decade. Nothing expensive, nothing unnecessary. She carried her bowl to the window and watched people walking below with umbrellas. For a moment, she thought about calling someone. Then she realized there was no one she wanted to burden. Not with this. Her eyes drifted toward a small wooden box resting on the bookshelf. Inside were the few possessions she treasured most. A photograph of her grandmother, the grocery receipt on which she had written, "I choose to live," and a tiny spool of golden thread, the same color Eleanor had once used to stitch a little star onto a navy blanket. Teresa picked up the thread gently. "So many years," she whispered. "I hope that little boy had a good life." She smiled to herself. Perhaps he had become a teacher, or a mechanic, maybe a father. She hoped someone had taught him kindness. She never imagined he had spent the entire day sitting only a few feet away from her, inside a courtroom. The next morning, Ethan arrived at work before sunrise. He bypassed his office entirely and headed straight toward the records division. The cleaning crew had not yet started. The hallway stood empty. He slowly walked the exact path Teresa had described. One step, then another. He stopped where the torn trash bag had appeared on camera. From that position, he looked towards the archive room, then toward the hallway intersection. Something caught his attention. Mounted high above the emergency exit was a small convex safety mirror designed to help maintenance carts see around corners. It reflected part of the archive doorway. Tiny, distorted, easy to overlook. Ethan stared at it. If that mirror reflected the hallway, then perhaps somewhere in the courthouse there existed another camera that had unknowingly captured that reflection. And if such footage still survived, it might reveal the one face everyone had failed to see. Ethan barely noticed that he had skipped breakfast. His mind kept returning to the convex safety mirror mounted above the emergency exit. It had been hanging there for years, installed simply to help maintenance workers avoid collisions with heavy carts around the blind corner. No investigator had mentioned it. No report included it. Most likely because no one thought it mattered. Sometimes Ethan reminded himself truth hid inside the things everyone considered ordinary. By 7:30 a.m., he was standing with Marcus Reed inside the courthouse's security office. Marcus looked at the grainy floor plan spread across the desk. "So your theory is another camera caught the reflection?" "Not directly, but maybe indirectly." Marcus rubbed his chin. "The hallway cameras overwrite after 30 days. "I know." "What about cameras from neighboring offices?" Marcus's eyes narrowed. "The judge's chambers." Without another word, both men headed toward the administrative wing. Unlike the main surveillance network, several judges maintained independent security cameras outside their chambers because confidential documents were regularly delivered there. Most recorded continuously. Some archived footage for months instead of weeks. An elderly IT technician named Walter Simmons greeted them. "I heard you're chasing ghosts," Marcus smiled. "We're hoping they're digital ghosts." Walter chuckled before logging into the courthouse archive system. "Which date?" "December 15th. "Fourth floor." Walter searched quietly. Hundreds of video files appeared. Most were routine. Hallways, service entrances, private corridors. Then Walter stopped. "Judge Bennett's hallway camera. It still exists." Ethan leaned forward. "Can we see it?" The footage began playing. Nothing happened for several minutes. Employees walked by. Attorneys entered offices. A delivery cart rolled past. Then, there! Marcus pointed at the screen. The camera couldn't see the archive room itself. But inside the curved reflection of the convex mirror, a blurred figure emerged carrying 2 archive boxes. Walter froze the frame. Ethan leaned closer. The reflection distorted the face. Impossible to identify. But one detail stood out immediately. The man walked with a noticeable limp. Marcus looked at Ethan. "You see it?" "I do." The figure favored his left leg. Walter enlarged the reflection. The image became rougher. Still, the limp remained unmistakable. Marcus immediately opened employee records. "Who on the 4th floor has a documented knee injury?" The database returned only 3 names. A 68-year-old clerk who had retired 6 months earlier. A bailiff currently on medical leave. And Daniel Brooks. 2 years earlier, Brooks had torn ligaments during a recreational softball game. The injury had healed, mostly. Coworkers occasionally joked that he still walked, like winter never ended. Marcus slowly leaned back. This is no longer coincidence. Ethan remained silent. Evidence was beginning to point in one direction, but he wanted certainty, not assumptions. Later that afternoon, Ethan requested permission to review Daniel Brooks's personnel records. Chief Prosecutor Diane Collins frowned. "Why?" "I want to eliminate possibilities. You already have a defendant." "I may have the wrong one." The room became very quiet. Diane closed her office door. "Ethan, do you understand what's happening outside this building? The newspapers already believe we've identified the thief." If you suddenly change direction, toots. People will question this office, Ethan answered carefully. I'd rather have people question our timing than our integrity. Diane stared at him for several long seconds. Finally, she sighed. Or you have 48 hours. No more. Outside her office, Ethan exhaled slowly. He knew those 48 hours might determine Teresa's future. Across the city, Teresa spent the afternoon searching for temporary work. Her suspension meant her paycheck had stopped. Rent would be due in less than 2 weeks. She visited 3 businesses, a grocery store, a laundromat, a neighborhood bakery. Each manager apologized politely. We're not hiring. By sunset, her feet ached. She stopped at a small public library, simply to rest for a while. The warmth inside reminded her of winters long ago. She wandered toward the community bulletin board. Among advertisements for tutoring and lost pets hung a flyer from a neighborhood shelter. Volunteers needed winter meal program. Teresa smiled. She had no job, no certainty, no guarantee her own future would improve. Yet she quietly wrote her phone number beneath the volunteer sign-up sheet. The librarian noticed. You know volunteers aren't paid. I know. You could probably use paying work. Teresa smiled gently. I can look for work tomorrow. Someone might need dinner tonight. The librarian watched her leave. Some people she thought carried kindness the way others carried umbrellas, without thinking, without expecting anything back. That evening, Ethan drove to the modest house where his mother had lived until her death. The property had recently been sold. Most belongings had already been sorted. Only one cardboard box remained inside the garage. Across its top, written in Rachel Mitchell's careful handwriting, were 4 words. For Ethan, when you're ready. He had postponed opening it for nearly a year. Grief had strange ways of measuring time. Tonight felt different. He carried the box to his apartment. Inside were childhood drawings, school report cards, birthday photographs, a tiny blue knit cap from infancy. Near the bottom rested a cream-colored envelope addressed simply, My son. His heartbeat quickened. Rachel's handwriting appeared slightly shaky, as though she had written the letter while ill. Ethan unfolded the pages carefully. The first lines made him smile. She spoke about childhood, his first bicycle, his first day at school, the first time he insisted on carrying groceries because he wanted to help. Then her words changed. There is something I never told you because I wanted you to discover it, only after I was gone. Ethan stopped breathing for a moment. He continued reading. The letter described a freezing December night at Union Station, a broken-down life, a frightened young mother, a baby whose lips had begun turning blue, and a woman who owned almost nothing. Except one beautiful navy blanket with a tiny golden star stitched into the corner. Rachel described how that stranger had wrapped the blanket around her baby without asking for anything in return. How she had repeated one sentence Rachel never forgot. Warmth is something you pass on. Tears blurred Ethan's vision. He continued reading. I never learned enough about her to repay her. I only knew her first name, Teresa. If you ever discover who she was, don't thank her with words. Live in a way that proves her sacrifice mattered. Folded inside the final page rested something small, a carefully preserved triangle of navy wool. Along one edge, golden thread formed part of a tiny, hand-stitched star. Ethan held the fabric between trembling fingers. The room around him seemed to disappear. Somewhere in Chicago, the woman who had saved his life might still be living completely unaware that the baby she once wrapped in her last blanket had grown into the prosecutor, now standing only a few feet away from her in court. Ethan did not sleep. Rachel's letter remained open on his kitchen table until sunrise. its edges held flat by the ceramic coffee mug his mother had used every morning for nearly 10 years. The small triangle of navy wool rested beside it. He had picked it up at least 20 times during the night, running his thumb across the faded golden stitches as though they might reveal something the letter could not. Teresa. Only a first name. 20 years earlier, that had been all his mother knew. Now Ethan knew one more thing. Teresa Howard, the courthouse janitor sitting at the defense table. He wanted to dismiss the thought immediately. Chicago had thousands of women named Teresa. Coincidences happened. But deep inside, he already knew coincidence was becoming harder to believe. At 7 o'clock, he called Marcus Reed. "I need a favor." Marcus yawned into the phone. "This better be important." "I think I know why I can't stop questioning this case." An hour later, the two men sat inside Marcus's office. Ethan carefully placed Rachel's letter on the desk. Marcus read it slowly. When he finished, he looked at Ethan without speaking. "So," Marcus finally said, "you think it's her?" "I don't know." "I need evidence." Marcus picked up the piece of blanket. The navy wool had faded with age, but the golden thread remained surprisingly bright. "Your mother kept this for 20 years. She carried it in her wallet for years before putting it away." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "This isn't evidence for court." "No, but it may tell us where to look." The first stop was New Hope Community Church. Pastor Samuel Green had retired several years earlier, but according to church records, he still volunteered every Wednesday morning. The old church looked much the same as it had decades before. Fresh paint covered the wooden doors, but the stained glass windows remained unchanged. Pastor Green greeted them warmly. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Ethan introduced himself before explaining they were researching an event from the winter of 2006. The pastor listened quietly. Then his expression softened. "I remember that winter. So many people needed shelter." Ethan carefully unfolded the letter. "Do you remember a young woman named Teresa?" Pastor Green didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the sanctuary. "As a pastor, I meet many people. I rarely forget names, but I almost never forget hearts." He smiled gently. "Yes, I remember Teresa Howard." Ethan felt his pulse quicken. "Can you tell me about her?" Pastor Green chuckled softly. "She kept apologizing." "For what?" "For accepting help." The old pastor shook his head. "I finally told her she'd apologized 7 times before breakfast." Marcus exchanged a quick glance with Ethan. The story matched Teresa's medical records exactly. "What happened after she recovered?" "She found work. She insisted on earning everything herself, even when we offered longer assistance." Pastor Green stood and walked toward a filing cabinet. "I might still have something." After several minutes, he returned, carrying an old donation ledger. Between its pages rested several handwritten intake forms from the church shelter. One page caught Ethan's attention immediately. Name Teresa Howard. Arrival date December 16th, 2006. Personal belongings canvas backpack. Family photograph. $18.43. Blanket none. Ethan stared at the final line. Blanket none. His mother had written that Teresa gave away her only blanket on the night of December 15th. The church record created the following morning confirmed she arrived without one. Marcus quietly photographed the page. "This helps." Pastor Green looked puzzled. "Is Teresa in trouble?" Ethan answered honestly. "She has been accused of something." The pastor's smile disappeared. "No." He spoke so firmly that both men looked at him. "If Teresa Howard tells you the sun rose in the west," he paused, "I'd check the compass before questioning her." On their way back downtown, neither man spoke much. Evidence was beginning to connect. Not legal proof that Teresa had saved Ethan's life, but proof that Rachel's story was real. Proof that Teresa had owned exactly one blanket. Proof that she had arrived at the shelter without it. Still, Ethan needed more. Much more. Back at the courthouse, he requested Teresa's original employment application from nearly 18 years earlier. Human Resources located it in archive storage. The yellowed paperwork included references previous employers' emergency contacts and one attached recommendation letter. It had been written by Pastor Samuel Green. The final paragraph read, "Miss Teresa Howard possesses a rare habit of placing another person's dignity before her own comfort. I have witnessed this personally during one of the coldest winters our city has endured." Ethan read the sentence twice, then a third time. His office door opened unexpectedly. Chief Prosecutor Diane Collins entered. "You've been busy." She noticed the church records spread across the desk. "Tell me why you're investigating a 20-year-old charity shelter." Ethan met her eyes. "Because I believe we've been asking the wrong questions." She folded her arms. "The hearing resumes tomorrow." "I know. You promised evidence." "I'm getting closer." Diane sighed. "Ethan, this case isn't only about one missing file anymore. The city is watching. So am I." After she left, Ethan looked again at the recommendation letter. One phrase stood out. "One of the coldest winters our city has endured." His thoughts drifted toward Teresa, while the courthouse debated whether she had stolen justice. No one had asked how many acts of quiet goodness she had left behind over the past 20 years. At that very moment, Teresa stood in the kitchen of the neighborhood shelter where she had volunteered the previous evening. She wore a simple apron over her sweater, stirring a giant pot of vegetable stew, while laughing softly with two elderly volunteers. No reporters were there. No cameras. No one from the courthouse knew she had come. A little boy carrying an empty bowl accidentally bumped into her. "I'm sorry." "It's okay." She knelt to his height. "Accidents happen." She filled his bowl first, then noticed his younger sister standing shyly behind him. Without saying a word, Teresa quietly split her own lunch into two smaller portions and handed one to each child. She kept nothing for herself. Across the room, the shelter director watched silently. Later that afternoon, she sat down to write a letter. Not because anyone had requested it, because some truths deserved to be recorded. She addressed it simply, "To whom it may concern. If you are ever asked to judge the character of Teresa Howard, I hope you will judge her by the hundreds of ordinary days no one bothered to witness, not by the one terrible day everyone happened to notice. Neither she nor Ethan knew it yet. But by the time the next court session began, the truth about Teresa Howard would no longer rest on a single piece of missing evidence. It would rest on the life she had quietly built, one unnoticed act of kindness at a time." The courtroom was scheduled to reconvene at 9 o'clock the following morning. At 8:07, Ethan Mitchell walked into the chief prosecutor's office carrying two thick binders and a worn cream-colored folder from New Hope Community Church. Diane Collins looked up from her desk. "You've made a decision." "I have." She studied his face for a moment. "It isn't the decision I wanted, is it?" Ethan placed the binders on her desk. "I cannot continue prosecuting Teresa Howard based on the evidence we currently have." Silence settled over the room. Diane slowly removed her glasses. "Do you understand what you're saying?" "Yes." "You've spent weeks on this case." "I know." "You've already presented evidence in court." "I know." "And now you're telling me the prosecution's theory is wrong," Ethan answered without hesitation. "I'm telling you our theory is incomplete." Diane stood and walked toward the window overlooking downtown Chicago. "Explain." Ethan opened the first binder. "The timeline doesn't support Teresa entering the archive." He laid out enlarged photographs from the reflected security footage. The access logs conflict with witness statements. He added the maintenance reports. The surveillance maintenance order was forged. Then he placed Daniel Brooks's personnel records on top. Finally, the only employee with both opportunity and documented access inconsistencies is Daniel Brooks. Diane crossed her arms. You still don't have direct proof? No. But we now have enough evidence to justify expanding the investigation. She looked at him carefully. Or enough evidence to embarrass this office. Ethan took a slow breath. I became a prosecutor to protect justice. Not convictions. Those words hung heavily between them. After several long seconds, Diane finally spoke. You have until the afternoon hearing. If you don't find something concrete, this case continues. Ethan nodded once. That's fair. Within minutes, he and Marcus Reed were back inside the records division. Marcus had already secured a warrant to examine Daniel Brooks's office computer. Brooks was temporarily reassigned while investigators searched the workspace. Every drawer was photographed, every cabinet cataloged, every storage box opened. For nearly 2 hours, they found nothing. Marcus closed another empty drawer with visible frustration. He's too careful. Ethan wasn't ready to give up. He planned the theft. That means he planned the hiding place. Marcus glanced around the office. Bookshelves, awards, family photographs. Everything looked perfectly ordinary. Almost too ordinary. Ethan walked slowly around the room. Daniel's desk was immaculate, every pen aligned, every folder squared with the edge. Then his eyes stopped on one object, a framed certificate from the Illinois Association of Court Administrators. Something felt off. He lifted the frame. It was heavier than expected. Marcus immediately noticed. What's inside? The back panel had been resealed recently. Marcus carefully removed the tape. Nothing, just cardboard. He laughed quietly. Wrong guess. But Ethan kept thinking. Someone meticulous enough to fake maintenance records wouldn't hide evidence inside an obvious compartment. He would hide it somewhere no one considered personal. Marcus's phone suddenly rang. He answered. What? His expression changed immediately. When? He looked toward Ethan. Officer Ramirez just remembered something. 10 minutes later, they met Luis in the security office. I wasn't sure it mattered. Luis looked embarrassed. The day before the theft, Daniel asked me whether old security hard drives were destroyed or recycled. Marcus frowned. What did you tell him? I said they stay in storage for 90 days before disposal. Ethan's eyes narrowed. 90 days. Marcus immediately understood. If Daniel thought old drives remained available, he may have tried removing one. They rushed toward the basement evidence storage room. An inventory clerk unlocked the secured shelves. Dozens of labeled hard drives filled metal racks. Everything appeared organized, until Marcus checked the inventory sheet. Drive B417. He scanned the shelves again. It's missing. When was it signed out? The clerk searched the electronic log. No authorization. So how did it disappear? Nobody answered. Marcus turned toward Ethan. That drive stored raw surveillance backups. Before they were compressed. If someone stole it, they stole the original video. At that exact moment, Daniel Brooks was walking briskly toward the courthouse parking garage, carrying a black leather briefcase. He had noticed investigators entering his office earlier that morning. Years of careful planning were beginning to unravel. He unlocked his car remotely. Just before reaching the driver's door, 2 investigators stepped into his path. Mr. Brooks. Daniel forced a smile. Can I help you? Marcus held up his badge. We'd like to ask a few more questions. About what? The missing surveillance drive. For the first time since the investigation began, Daniel's smile disappeared. I don't know anything about that. Marcus nodded calmly. Then you won't mind if we look inside your briefcase. Daniel hesitated, only for a second, but 1 second was enough. I'd rather speak with my attorney. You absolutely may. Marcus's voice remained polite. But until then, the briefcase stays with us. Daniel's shoulders stiffened. As investigators documented the chain of custody, Ethan watched quietly. He wasn't celebrating. He knew suspicion alone proved nothing. The briefcase was opened inside the evidence room under full video recording. Inside were ordinary office supplies, a laptop, financial paperwork, a lunch container. Nothing else. Marcus sighed. I thought we had him. Ethan noticed the lunch container. It looked unusually heavy. May I? Marcus handed it over. It was made of stainless steel, with a false insulated bottom. Ethan twisted the base gently. It didn't move. He tried again. A hidden latch clicked. The bottom compartment separated. Inside rested a small external hard drive wrapped carefully in plastic. No one spoke. Marcus slowly removed it using evidence gloves. The serial number matched drive B417, the original surveillance backup. Within minutes, forensic technicians connected the recovered drive to an isolated computer. Video files appeared, untouched, unedited. Marcus opened the recording from December 15th. The footage played. At 3:33 p.m., Teresa stood outside the archive hallway, replacing a torn trash bag, exactly as she had described. 30 seconds later, Daniel Brooks exited the archive room carrying 2 document boxes. He looked over both shoulders, used his supervisor card to lock the door, then quietly disappeared into the records office. The original footage captured everything. No editing, no missing angles, only the truth. Marcus leaned back in disbelief. There it is. Ethan remained silent. Not because he felt victorious, because his mind had already moved to Teresa. At that very moment, she was sitting alone, outside courtroom 4B, waiting for the afternoon hearing, unaware that the evidence capable of restoring her name had finally been found. She quietly folded her hands together. Not to pray for freedom, only to pray that whoever had truly committed the crime would find the courage to tell the truth before another innocent person had to suffer. She had no way of knowing that the truth was already making its way upstairs. At precisely 1:30 that afternoon, courtroom 4B filled faster than it had on any previous day. Word had spread through the courthouse that the prosecution had requested permission to submit newly discovered evidence. No one knew what that evidence was. Reporters hurried into the gallery carrying fresh notebooks. Television crews were not allowed inside the courtroom, but producers waited outside the doors, ready to interrupt regular programming if something significant happened. Teresa sat quietly beside Melissa Grant. She noticed Ethan speaking softly with Detective Marcus Reed near the clerk's desk. Neither man looked the way they had during previous hearings. They no longer carried the confidence of people certain they had found the right answer. They looked like men carrying the weight of admitting they had been wrong. Judge Harold Bennett entered the courtroom. Everyone rose. After the customary opening formalities, the judge looked toward the prosecution. Mr. Mitchell, I understand you have an unexpected motion. Yes, Your Honor. Ethan stood slowly. For the first time since becoming a prosecutor, he felt the familiar structure of courtroom procedure offering no comfort at all. He walked to the center of the courtroom. His voice remained steady. The state requests permission to reopen its evidentiary presentation based upon forensic evidence recovered this morning. Melissa Grant looked surprised. So, granted, Judge Bennett replied. The court will hear the new evidence. Marcus Reed was called back to the witness stand. He explained how investigators had recovered the original surveillance drive hidden inside a modified compartment beneath Daniel Brooks's lunch container. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. Then the lights dimmed. The recovered surveillance footage appeared on the courtroom monitor. There was no missing 43 seconds, no uncertainty, no blurred accusation. The video showed Teresa replacing a torn trash bag exactly where she had always said she had been. Moments later, Daniel Brooks emerged from the archive room carrying the missing case files before concealing them inside ordinary storage boxes. The recording continued. Every movement was clear. Every timestamp matched. Every explanation Teresa had given suddenly became undeniable. No one spoke until the video ended. Judge Bennett removed his glasses. He had presided over countless criminal trials, but very few moments carried the same quiet force as undeniable truth. He looked toward Daniel Brooks, who sat stiffly behind his attorney. "Mr. Brooks," the judge's voice was calm, "you are now advised that this court has probable cause to believe you committed multiple criminal offenses, including evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy." Daniel's attorney leaned toward him urgently. For several seconds, Daniel remained frozen. His carefully constructed confidence disappeared. He looked across the courtroom. For just an instant, his eyes met Teresa's. She did not glare at him. She did not smile. She simply looked at him with an expression that seemed almost sorrowful. That unsettled him more than anger ever could. Judge Bennett turned toward Teresa. "The charges presently before this court against Miss Howard cannot stand." He paused briefly. "This court therefore dismisses all allegations against Teresa Howard with immediate effect." A collective breath escaped throughout the courtroom. Melissa closed her eyes for a moment before quietly squeezing Teresa's hand. "We did it." Teresa whispered almost automatically, "No." The truth did. She stood slowly, not because she wanted attention, only because her knees suddenly felt weak. For nearly 3 weeks, she had lived beneath suspicion. She had watched neighbors avoid conversation. She had lost her job. She had questioned whether 18 years of honest work could truly disappear because of one accusation. Now, in less than a minute, the truth had returned her name. Yet strangely, she felt no triumph, only relief. Judge Bennett looked toward Ethan. "Mr. Mitchell." "Yes, Your Honor." The judge spoke carefully. "The integrity of this office today has been strengthened, not weakened." Several reporters looked up from their notes. Judge Bennett continued. "It takes integrity to prosecute the guilty. It takes greater integrity to acknowledge when the evidence requires changing course." Ethan lowered his head respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor." He knew those words would remain with him for the rest of his career. Daniel Brooks finally stood. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder. "I advise my client to invoke his constitutional rights." Before anyone could continue, Daniel spoke quietly. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." The courtroom turned toward him. Marcus watched silently. Daniel swallowed. "I only intended to remove the financial records. I never planned for anyone else to be blamed." His own attorney looked stunned. Daniel continued anyway. "When security focused on Miss Howard, I told myself the investigation would eventually clear her." His voice cracked. "But every day it became easier to stay silent." Judge Bennett listened without interruption. "There will be another proceeding concerning your admissions." Daniel nodded weakly. "I understand." Court officers approached. As they placed him into custody, Daniel hesitated beside Teresa. The apology refused to come. No sentence seemed large enough. Teresa looked at him gently. "I hope one day you tell the truth as completely as you've hidden it." Daniel lowered his eyes. Then he walked away. The courtroom remained unusually still. No one rushed for the exit. Even the reporters seemed reluctant to disturb the moment. Ethan gathered his files slowly. Inside his briefcase rested something he had carried with him all morning. Rachel's letter. And beside it, the small triangle of navy wool with the faded golden stitches. He reached into the briefcase. His fingers paused on the fabric. Not yet. He had imagined this moment repeatedly throughout the hearing. Part of him wanted to walk directly to Teresa, to tell her everything, to thank her. But another part understood that this courtroom had already carried enough emotion for one day. She deserved first to breathe as a free woman, to stand without accusation, to reclaim the dignity that had always been hers. He quietly closed the briefcase again. As Teresa prepared to leave, she noticed Ethan approaching. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, Ethan extended his hand. "I'm sorry." 2 simple words. Nothing rehearsed, nothing legal, nothing hidden behind courtroom language. Teresa looked at him for a long moment before accepting the handshake. "I know." Her answer surprised him. "You do? You were willing to change when the evidence changed." She smiled gently. "That isn't weakness. That's honesty." Ethan felt an unexpected tightness in his throat. He wanted to say so much more. About the letter, about his mother, about the blanket. Instead, he simply nodded. "There is something important I'd like to show you." Teresa tilted her head slightly. "What is it?" Ethan looked toward the nearly empty courtroom. His hand rested once more on the briefcase containing the tiny piece of navy wool. "It can wait a few more minutes." He smiled softly. "But I think it's going to explain why our lives crossed long before this trial ever began." Most people had already left the courtroom. The reporters hurried outside to file breaking stories. Attorneys returned to overflowing inboxes. Court officers escorted Daniel Brooks downstairs to begin the formal booking process. Within 15 minutes, courtroom 4B, so crowded only moments before, had become almost silent. Only a handful of people remained. Judge Harold Bennett sat quietly at the bench reviewing paperwork. Melissa Grant packed her files, but deliberately lingered. Detective Marcus Reed leaned against the back wall. Officer Luis Ramirez stood near the entrance. None of them intended to intrude, yet none of them wanted to leave. They all sensed something unfinished still lingered inside the room. Teresa slowly placed her worn canvas backpack over one shoulder. For the first time in weeks, she felt she could breathe without carrying the weight of suspicion. She turned toward the exit. "Miss Howard." Ethan's voice stopped her. She turned back. He stood near the prosecution table, holding a cream-colored envelope in one hand. His expression looked nothing like that of a prosecutor. It looked like a son. "Would you have a few more minutes?" Teresa smiled gently. "I think I do." He walked toward her slowly. For a moment, words refused to come. He had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times in his mind. Now every prepared sentence felt too small. Instead, he carefully removed something from the envelope. A tiny triangle of faded navy wool. One corner still carried delicate golden stitches, shaped like part of a small star. Teresa froze. Her eyes remained fixed on the cloth. The courtroom disappeared around her. She reached forward with trembling fingers, but stopped just before touching it. "Where?" Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Did you get this?" Ethan swallowed. "My mother kept it." Teresa looked at him in confusion. He unfolded the letter. "The night you gave away your blanket." "The woman holding the baby was my mother." Silence. Absolute silence. Even the old courthouse heating system seemed to pause. Teresa finally accepted the small piece of fabric into her hands. She traced the faded golden thread exactly as she had done 20 years earlier. Her fingertips recognized every stitch. "My grandmother." She smiled through gathering tears. She always sewed stars over torn places. Ethan nodded. My mother wrote about that. He handed Teresa the letter. She read slowly. Every line brought another memory rushing back. The freezing station, Rachel's exhausted face, the tiny baby wrapped inside the blanket, the little hand that had briefly wrapped around her finger. When she reached the sentence, "If you ever discover who she was, don't thank her with words. Live in a way that proves her sacrifice mattered." She stopped reading. A tear slipped quietly onto the paper. "I remember her," Teresa whispered. "She loved that little boy so much." She looked up. "You." Ethan smiled through tears of his own. "I was 3 months old. I don't remember that night. But my whole life exists because of what you did." Teresa slowly shook her head. "No. Because your mother never gave up." Ethan laughed softly. "That sounds exactly like something she would say." Judge Bennett quietly stepped down from the bench. He did not interrupt. He simply stood nearby, witnessing. Teresa folded the letter carefully before returning it. "I always wondered." She looked toward Ethan. "Every winter, I hoped the baby survived. I wondered if he became happy." Ethan smiled. "My mother worked 2 jobs. She finished nursing school. She reminded me almost every winter that strangers could become family for a single night." He paused. "She never stopped searching for you." Teresa lowered her eyes. "There was nothing to find." "There was," he gently corrected. "There was someone who deserved to be known." She smiled sadly. "I didn't need to be known. I only wanted you both to live." Marcus quietly cleared his throat. "I've investigated crimes for 28 years. He smiled. "This may be the first case I've ever worked where the best evidence wasn't about guilt." Everyone looked toward him. "It was about character." Luis nodded. "I've been trying to think all afternoon." Teresa turned toward him. "The coloring book?" He laughed. "My granddaughter still sleeps with it beside her bed." Teresa looked surprised. "I'd forgotten all about that." Luis smiled warmly. "That's the thing. You forgot. The people you helped didn't." Melissa Grant stepped closer. "You know, I asked around after taking your case." Teresa looked confused. "I found 23 people willing to write letters for you." She opened a folder. "There were actually more." She smiled. "I just stopped counting." Teresa looked overwhelmed. "I never knew." Melissa shook her head. "Most kindness happens that way. The person receiving it remembers. The person giving it moves on." Judge Bennett folded his hands behind his back. "In 41 years on the bench, I've sentenced dangerous people. I've acquitted innocent people. I've watched families fall apart." He looked at Teresa. "But today reminded me why justice must always remain patient." He paused. "If we hurry too quickly toward judgment, we often walk right past the truth." No one answered. No one needed to. Ethan looked once more at the tiny piece of blanket. "There was one sentence my mother remembered all her life." Teresa smiled before he could continue. "Warmth is something you pass on." He nodded. "I grew up hearing those words. I never knew where they came from." Teresa laughed softly. "My grandmother probably never imagined they'd travel this far." Ethan carefully took the small triangle of blanket and placed it back into Teresa's hands. "It belongs with you." She gently closed his fingers around it instead. "No. It belongs with us." He looked puzzled. She smiled. "If it stayed with only one person, the story would end." She glanced towards the courthouse windows where snow had begun falling outside. "But warmth..." Her voice remained calm. was never meant to stay in one place. Ethan understood. He carefully returned the keepsake to the envelope, not as a debt, not as a trophy, but as a promise. Together they walked slowly toward the courtroom doors. As they reached the hallway, a young mother stood nearby, holding a sleepy little girl wrapped in a thin jacket while waiting for a family court hearing. The child shivered. Without thinking, Teresa removed her own wool scarf and gently wrapped it around the little girl's shoulders. The mother began to protest. Teresa only smiled. "It's warm." The little girl looked up at her with grateful eyes. Ethan watched quietly. Then, almost instinctively, he finished the sentence his mother had carried for 20 years. "Warmth is something you pass on." Teresa looked at him and smiled. This time, they both understood exactly what those words meant. 1 year later, winter returned to Chicago. Snow drifted gently across the streets, settling on park benches, train tracks, and the broad stone steps leading into Union Station. The city looked much the same as it had 20 years earlier. But for Teresa Howard, everything felt different. She no longer woke before dawn to polish courthouse floors. A small retirement celebration had been held the previous spring. There had been no grand speeches, no expensive gifts, only laughter, handwritten cards, and a standing ovation from judges, clerks, bailiffs, and maintenance workers who finally realized how much of the courthouse's quiet strength had always come from the woman who asked for so little. Judge Harold Bennett had spoken only one sentence that afternoon. "Buildings are cleaned with mops, but institutions are sustained by character." Teresa had carried those words home with her. Retirement suited her more gently than she expected. 3 mornings each week, she volunteered at neighborhood shelters. On Saturdays, she helped children learn basic cooking skills at a community center. On Sundays, she attended New Hope Community Church, where Pastor Samuel Green Older, now his hair almost completely white, still greeted everyone with the same warm smile. She lived simply. The apartment had not changed much. The squeaky rocking chair remained by the window. The second-hand bookshelf still leaned slightly to one side. The kettle still whistled every afternoon. The only meaningful addition rested on the wall above her reading chair. Inside a modest wooden frame was a photograph taken outside courtroom 4B Teresa. Ethan, Judge Bennett, Marcus Reed, Linda Foster, Officer Luis Ramirez. No one in the photograph looked toward the camera. They were laughing about something no one else would ever hear again. It was Teresa's favorite picture because it looked honest. Across the city, Ethan Mitchell had also changed. He was still a prosecutor, still meticulous, still believed deeply in accountability. But after Teresa's case, he no longer measured justice only by winning. Young attorneys often noticed that he asked different questions during case reviews. Not, "Can we prove it?" but first, "Have we looked hard enough for the whole truth?" Some thought he had become more cautious. Marcus Reed preferred another description. He finally learned the difference between certainty and honesty. Several months after Teresa's retirement, Ethan called her with an idea. "I've been thinking," she laughed softly. "That usually means you're about to volunteer me for something." "Maybe. I'd like to start a winter program." "What kind?" He hesitated. For families sleeping in stations." Teresa became very quiet. Ethan continued. "Not just handing out blankets. We'll partner with shelters. Provide transportation. Emergency housing. Legal aid. Medical referrals. And every blanket," he smiled, "will have one small golden star stitched into the corner." Teresa closed her eyes. For a brief moment, she could almost hear Eleanor Howard humming while sewing beside the living room window decades earlier. She would have liked that, Teresa whispered. The project became known throughout Chicago as Blue Blanket Winter. No one's name appeared in the title. Not Teresa's, not Ethan's, because neither believed kindness belonged to one person. The first community event took place exactly 1 year after Teresa had been cleared in court. Volunteers gathered before sunrise inside Union Station. Church members, law students, police officers, former courthouse employees, high school students, retired nurses. Even Judge Harold Bennett arrived carrying boxes, despite insisting everyone stop calling him Your Honor. Hundreds of neatly folded navy blankets filled long tables across the waiting hall. Every one of them carried a tiny golden embroidered star. People passing through the station stopped to ask what the symbol meant. The volunteers all gave the same It reminds us that even torn places can become beautiful. Teresa stood near the entrance, greeting families one by one. She didn't ask why they needed help. She didn't ask how they had become homeless. Experience had taught her that dignity often begins with allowing people to tell their stories only when they are ready. Late that afternoon, a young mother entered the station carrying an infant wrapped in a thin sweatshirt. The baby's cheeks had turned pink from the cold. The sight stopped Teresa where she stood. For just a heartbeat. She was 27 again. She saw Rachel. She heard the echo of a baby crying through the winter darkness. She remembered the weight of the blanket leaving her shoulders. The young mother looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I heard someone was giving these away." "You heard right." Teresa picked up a navy blanket from the table. Before wrapping it around the baby, she gently smoothed one tiny corner where the golden star had been stitched. The mother noticed it immediately. "Why a star?" Teresa smiled. "My grandmother used to mend torn things instead of throwing them away." She carefully wrapped the blanket around the child. "She taught me that warmth is never something we keep." The young mother looked confused. Teresa's smile grew a little brighter. "It's something we pass on." Nearby, Ethan watched quietly. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The circle had closed exactly where it had begun. As evening settled over Union Station, the last of the blankets found new owners. Children laughed beneath warm wool. Parents accepted cups of soup. Volunteers packed away empty boxes. Snow continued falling outside. Teresa looked through the station doors toward the quiet city beyond. 20 years earlier, she had walked into this building believing she had lost everything. She left that night with nothing but hope. Now she stood in the same place watching hundreds of strangers carry warmth home. She realized something beautiful. The blanket had never really been the gift. The gift had been the choice. One small decision made in silence. A decision no cameras captured. A decision no newspaper reported. A decision that quietly traveled from one heart to another until it reached people she would never even meet. Teresa slipped her hands into her coat pockets and smiled at the softly falling snow. For the first time in many years, winter no longer reminded her of what she had lost. It reminded her of everything that had continued growing because she chose kindness on the coldest night of her life. Sometimes we believe our smallest acts disappear the moment they leave our hands. A shared meal, a warm coat, a few encouraging words, or a quiet sacrifice may seem insignificant in the rush of everyday life. But kindness has a remarkable way of traveling farther than we ever imagine. It changes not only the person receiving it, but also the people they later touch. Teresa never expected recognition. She never gave away her blanket, hoping that someone would repay her 20 years later. She simply saw a child who needed warmth more than she did. That choice became part of another family's story, another generation's values, and eventually an entire community's mission. Real character is often built in moments when nobody is watching. The world may overlook those moments, but they are never wasted. They become invisible threads connecting lives in ways we cannot predict. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Has a stranger's kindness ever changed your life? Or have you experienced a moment when you chose to help someone without expecting anything in return? Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to tell us where you're watching from and what your local time is. If you enjoy heartfelt stories about compassion, resilience, and second chances, please share this video with someone who might need a little hope today, and consider subscribing so we can continue this journey together.